Now, throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to respond either throughout the presentation or at the time reserved for the Q&A at the end. If any questions aren't answered during the Q&A, we will answer them in a follow-up email. So let's get started by telling you a little bit about InCycle software. We've been around since 2002, and we're a Gold ALM and Cloud partner. We're mostly focused on TFS-related services, such as installation and migrations, release management, and agile tool training. From the Azure perspective, we also perform related services, such as infrastructure setup and application migrations. These are just a few examples, but we really cover the full ALM, DevOps, and Azure-related spectrum. We have consultants across Canada and the US, so we most likely have someone in your area. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter, Gregory Sheppard. Gregory is a senior Azure consultant with us. He's a seasoned architect with a lot of experience in developing and helping customers take advantage of the Azure platform. His experience is in a broad range of Azure, such as storage, mobile development, web applications development, and much more. Over the next 45 minutes, Gregory will be discussing how to get started with the Azure Portal. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Gregory.
Thanks, Stephanie, for that gracious introduction. And on behalf of InCycle, InCycle's marketing department, and Microsoft, I'd like to thank each of you for joining this presentation today on getting started with the Azure Portal. So there are a couple of things that we'd like to accomplish, and we hope that you'll have a better understanding of, one, how you can support your DevOps initiative with Azure, which Azure portal is best for your workloads, how the portal can be used to manage applications, and how to monitor and scale your applications. Overall, the agenda is in 3 parts. I'll quickly go through an overview of DevOps. I'll talk a little bit about the Azure Compute resources, and then we'll go into managing Azure using the portal, just some quick concepts as an overview, and then we're going to do a live demo. And then we should have some time for questions and answers. Now, I remember back in high school and college days, when pop quizzes would show up, it was always an opportunity to get my adrenaline flowing, and I think perhaps professors used to use it for that reason. I thought it might be a great opportunity to just do a little cloud DevOps sort of trivia. So 3 questions, and I'm going to just present the question, give you about 5 seconds, I guess, quietly to think about what the answer is, and then I'll present the answer. So today the first question is, Azure is an extension of a computing model established at Dartmouth College in the 1960s. Is that A, shared services, B, offshoring, C, time sharing, or D, parallel computing? The answer is time sharing. So time sharing has been around since the 60s, and basically technology has allowed us to recreate that centralized distribution model and really make it work. It's actually kind of an amazing thing what Microsoft's been able to accomplish with Azure, and I think we're likely to see some more amazing things as we move forward in the future. Second question. Tim Berners-Lee, who's one of the fathers of the Internet, is credited with coining the term cloud computing. In what year did he coin the term cloud computing? Was it 1988, 1994, C, 2001, or D, 2005? The answer is 1988. So the idea of cloud computing has been around quite some time, and here we are today. It's really kind of come all full circle and has really become a reality, and a very ubiquitous reality for most businesses today, and quite frankly for most consumers. computing is showing up everywhere. The question is, DevOps is sometimes described as application lifecycle management focused on dev and ops. Which company has been at the forefront of ALM since 2005? Is it A, IBM, B, Dell, C, InCycle, or D, Amazon? Oh, the answer is InCycle. InCycle's been around doing this since 2005. We've gotten pretty good at it, and as a result, Microsoft and InCycle have a pretty good partnership, and we are continuing to innovate in that space. And at the same time, adopting Azure and its use through DevOps, ALM, and other workloads in large organizations and small and emerging organizations. So let's get on with the presentation. So I'm going to do a quick overview of DevOps. If you are one of those organizations that has recently adopted DevOps, leveraging Azure, you've probably read that or done your research and you've seen a number of different definitions for DevOps. I'm going to offer another one here. It's pretty straightforward. DevOps is an emerging trend that promises to increase the flow of value for customers. It's a little bit generic on purpose because DevOps is not just a one thing or this thing or that thing. DevOps is a combination of techniques, processes, collaboration, all coming together to bring value to customers. The big picture is that when we put together culture, automation, lean approaches to business, metrics to help us get feedback and to demonstrate our improvement, and sharing, lots of sharing, we have the big picture of what DevOps is. So the takeaway here is it's not just culture, it's not just the hearts and minds of people, it's not just embracing change, but it's culture and automation. So that's continuous integration, continuous deployment, infrastructure as a code, and culture, automation, and lean. So that focusing on producing value for the end user is important. Small batch sizes are important. But metrics are also important, and measuring everything and showing improvement is obviously very important. And ultimately, adding together there at the bottom is sharing, a very open, collaborative, transparent approach to sharing information and to some degree responsibility represents the big picture of DevOps. How do you know when that big elephant in the room is DevOps? Well, it's definitely DevOps if development and operations are collaborating. You can say it's definitely DevOps if you're treating your infrastructure as code. You can say it's definitely DevOps if you're using automation. You can definitely say it's DevOps if you're using feature switches. You can definitely say it's DevOps if you're using small deployments and small releases to deliver value quicker to your customer or to your product owner. And yes, you can use Kanban for ops. So in the big picture here again, that big elephant in the room is probably DevOps if you see one or many of these things going on in your organization. Now, as it relates to Azure and features that are common to DevOps, and I just like to add that this presentation is not just specifically DevOps, but again, our topic was that we assume the scenario was that your organization has adopted DevOps using Azure, and you'd like to get started with the Azure Portal. So some of the features that are common within Azure to DevOps are quite frankly most of the features. Cloud services, when you consider web worker role applications, it's the traditional approach to developing and deploying applications in Azure. App services, which is the sort of the preferred way today, which includes web apps, mobile apps, API apps, logic apps. Applications Insight, which gives you the opportunity to get metrics on your application, how it's operating, how quickly your users are getting content in the request response cycle, audit logs. Again, the big picture of cloud services, MySQL databases, SQL Server databases, OS disk, cache, storage accounts, subscription, team projects, virtual machines, virtual networks. All of these things, roughly, I'd say this is probably close to 80+% of what's in Azure is very common to DevOps scenarios and DevOps workloads. So I'm going to quickly go through Azure compute resources. Ultimately, in building and ultimately deploying applications, you're going to have some kind of a target compute resource that's going to host that application. In the Azure framework, there are infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. From an infrastructure as a service perspective, virtual machines are the platform or the target opportunity for your workload. Obviously, Azure and the Azure cloud is more than just infrastructure as a service, but virtual machines do provide the most flexible for managing workloads in the cloud. One, because it's, and also I think it's important to note, not just in virtual machines, but virtually everything within the Azure framework is fully automatable. And you can start, stop, and provision virtual machines using automation or automation scripts. Within DevOps and DevOps scenarios, there are a number of opportunities for using virtual machines. One is the dev test scenario, where you're going to spin up an environment for dev and test to allow you to ensure the quality of your applications, and you can spin this, say, a dev test environment up in the Azure framework, use it to perform your operations, and stop or unconfigure or remove those resources when they're no longer needed. Lift and shift, which is a term you may have heard in terms of moving applications from your data center into the Azure infrastructure as a virtual machine, and extending your data center. So these three represent common scenarios for DevOps and opportunities to leverage the Azure framework. It's important to note that it's really easy to create a virtual machine or to create an instance of a virtual machine in the Azure framework. You can create an image, a VHD, of something that's actually already running in your data center. You can upload that to an Azure storage account, and then from that storage account, you can actually create an instance of that virtual machine. Or from the multitude of images that are available in the Azure gallery, you can select any number of images that effectively can be deployed or instantiated with the click of a mouse. So creating and managing virtual machines is very easy in Azure, and can support a number of scenarios in your DevOps initiatives. In the platform as a service arena, we effectively have two approaches. One is what we'll traditionally call role-based cloud service, and because the term cloud service it's sort of been out there for quite some time, and it was also used to define in the earlier, I'd say early, and early is a very relative term in the Azure framework, but cloud service was a sort of a deployment approach in developing web apps that had web roles and worker roles in a framework together, interacting with storage or other Azure resources. So cloud service is still effectively a service. It represents sort of a container of resources that could include a virtual network, web apps divided into web roles and worker roles, storage accounts, and other resources. And I'm using the term web-based cloud service to distinguish that from overall cloud services. But in this role-based cloud service, it's a legacy approach, if you will, to building and deploying web apps in the Azure framework, compared to what we'll chat about next, which is the app service. It does give you greater control over the underlying virtual machine, and also provides you with remote access to the machine. You have the ability to install some software on the virtual machine, but vis-a-vis the more recent additions to the Azure framework, namely app service. The app service is the preferred approach to developing and deploying and managing applications in the Azure framework. But role-based cloud services are still out there, and you can still use them, and they still have a place in the framework. App service, which is effectively a consolidation of, if you are familiar with the Azure framework or have been around it for, let's say, at least a year, you may be familiar with what was called websites, mobile services, and perhaps BizTalk. App service is Microsoft's attempt to bring these three together and offer a more unified approach to resources and a sort of a cloud service approach to a container that allows you to manage all of these resources, particularly web apps, logic apps, mobile apps, and what's called API apps together. It also provides a more scalable approach to allow you to scale a mobile app or a logic app or all those resources together as a unit. And again, common access to API apps and simplifies management. In the past, effectively, each of those different services, web, mobile services, and BizTalk, all had slightly different, we'll say, syntax or approaches to using various APIs. And so this consolidation in app service makes everything more equal and a lot more easy to manage and deploy. The preferred approach to building, deploying web applications. So the key component of our conversation today is managing Azure using the portal. And it's important to know that Azure has two portals, and it's not an attempt to confuse, which it may at some point to some of us, but it really represents what we'll call the traditional approach, which is the first management portal, which is actually called the management portal, and the preview portal, which is effectively a beta portal. And are there differences between the two? The answer is the core resources that are in the Azure portal can all be managed from both of those. However, new services, and particularly services that come out as preview services, will show up first in the preview portal. And in fact, some of them may never make it into the management portal. And at the same time, there are some services and resources that are only managed from the management portal, look at the preview portal. If you're trying to manage a resource and it's not in the preview portal, it's going to be in the management portal. Obviously, as time moves on, the preview portal will make the management portal obsolete, but that time hasn't come yet, so we are ultimately using both. So we're going to go through a live demo, and hopefully the demo gods are working with us today. As we know, demos can be a little hairy at times, but in this demo, I'm going to go through the app servers. We're going to talk a little bit about web apps, and through both of the portals, I'm going to show you how we can create a web app, how we can integrate source control, how we can create deployment slots, how we can integrate our Visual Studio tool into developing code and persisting our code in source control, and how that source control can be integrated into the Azure portal to create continuous deployment. We'll talk a little bit about web, or we'll show you and talk about web app diagnostics and web app A/B testing, and we'll talk about application insights, which is a feature in the Azure platform that allows you to effectively get a great deal of insight into your application's health, into the experience that your users are experiencing in terms of request and response, and also, the variety of different metrics that you might imagine are out there in terms of keeping track of your application. So now we're going to switch over, and we're going to do we're going to actually go and take a look at the Azure portals. So this, I think in a couple slides, I showed that there are two URLs. One is portal.azure.com, which is the URL for the preview portal, which is what we're looking at here. I like to describe this as a little bit like a Windows 8-ish interface. It's probably not 100% accurate, but you see live tiles, and you can pin things to the primary home screen. What makes this different is that things tend to fly out towards the right, and we have an expanding canvas. It may be a little less intuitive to some people in terms of how web applications work, because most of the time we're used to getting the full view of what's available and then making choices. This gives us sort of more of a master detail view where you have an item of interest and you drill down into it. So we can see here that we can take a look at the overall Azure system, and we can get surface health. We can see that that across all the regions where there are data centers, in this particular case, we have green arrows indicating that all the services are up and running, which is a nice feature to have. If you're wondering if, for example, your site's not responding and your site's located in a particular region, you can quickly get some sense of whether or not it's a problem with your application or with the Azure system itself. We have access here in this middle tile to our subscription. Here we can see that I have two subscriptions that are being managed by my login. How much money is currently being charged, so we can keep track of our spend. And I mentioned that there are two portals. We actually have a tile here that portal, let's go take a quick look at the management portal. So it's still working, but it's sometimes fast, sometimes a little slow. So you can see this interface is what I might say a little more typical of what we know is more traditional web apps, where we have a left-hand panel which represents effectively all the things that we can do or that are of most important to us. We have this this link at the top that says all items. So this basically shows us, going down the left, all the items that are available in the Azure that can be managed here from the management portal. So key things, we talked about web apps, virtual machines, mobile services, cloud services. I mentioned databases, storage accounts, Visual Studio Online, BizTalk, recovery services, content delivery network, automation scheduling, machine learning, which is a really neat tool, networks in terms of developing net resources in the cloud, traffic manager, which is to help us move traffic and manage traffic to dispersed web applications around data centers around the world or domestic. Azure Active Directory, which is effectively a lightweight version of Active Directory, but more specifically designed to work in the cloud. So there's a variety of resources that we can see here. In particular, we're going to talk about web applications, in particular because this represents probably the most common approach to building and deploying applications. And again, web applications in contrast to cloud services. So I have a fairly straightforward web application that I'm going to use for this walkthrough. And let's first start with understanding what the portal provides us in terms of tools, in terms of looking at or managing a web application. So the first thing I want to note here is that when you're using the management portal, sometimes it's often a little confusing about, hey, where'd everything go? You have this big arrow here, and it represents sort of a back button. So that sort of gets you back to your primary navigation interface on the left. And you'll notice when I mouse over that effectively this particular row gets highlighted. If there were several rows, if there were more than one, then it would highlight the row that you're mousing over. Down here at the bottom, you have features, or we'll call it, say, perhaps commands, that allow you to perform an action on this particular web application. So I could stop or start this application. If I were using custom domains, I could manage my domains. I can swap deployments, say from QA to test as an example, if I had those. So sometimes this may not be intuitive, but these features actually relate to the particular row that you've highlighted. Also, in this particular view, you can see that I have this web app called GS DevOps Webinar, and it's currently running. The name of my subscription is an MSDN account. And this particular application is deployed in the South Central data center. It's pricing tier is standard in this particular case, and here's a URL that I can use to get to that application. So once we begin to drill down, one of the first things that, or one of the common, or the simplest tools to use is the dashboard, because this gives us a fairly good perspective of this particular web application. In the dashboard, we're going to see a graphical display that you can configure, but in this particular case, it shows CPU time, the amount of data transfer into, so there's effectively requests, and data out as response, any HTTP server errors if there were any, and requests. So there's the ability to change this over time periods for 24 hours, 7 days, or say just the last hour, and you can see the time scale down at the bottom there. You can see again we have another link back to the preview portal, and you're going to see these links in various places because they effectively help navigate and use the portals effectively. Trying to think what else is really important here. I can access operation logs here. Again, here you see the URL for this particular application, the pricing tier. If I use FTP, here's my FTP host. Here are diagnostic links that I can download from FTP. Again, here's the location, the subscription ID. So the dashboard gives you a quick perspective of most of the resources that are or issues that are germane to managing this web application. When I think about configuring this web application, there are a number of things that can be important. In this case, this is a .NET application. You can see that I can use v.3.5 or 4.5. If this were a PHP application, I can select the PHP version, Java, Python. Again, in the managed pipeline for IIS, I can choose classic or integrated, 32-bit or 64-bit platform, turn WebSockets on and off. If I had a certificate, if I could upload a certificate, I can manage domains. So if I were going to use HTTPS, I could add my domain name and a certificate to allow SSL to the application. I can turn on application diagnostics. In this particular case, I've already turned them on. I'm not using the table storage, so this is off. Site diagnostics are on. You can obviously see there's just a whole bunch of things that are going on here. So it's fairly comprehensive. I can monitor endpoints, so I can ping endpoints to make sure my service is active. I've got developer analytics that are available. And if you decide that you don't want to use in the .NET, at least from the .NET perspective, frameworks perspective, the web config to define configuration values, you can actually define app settings here in the platform, which at least keeps some of that secure information like passwords away from web configs and moves them into higher level configuration that's secured by an administrator for the application. And then these values become available at runtime to the application. If you're familiar with developing handlers in the .NET framework, you can actually add handler mappings here in the framework in the Azure portal again. Okay, so a bunch of things going on here in terms of being able to manage a web app. So I'm going to go back to the preview portal, one, because I think oftentimes it's a little bit more, with the color and the other features, it's sometimes a little easier to see the big picture of some of the features. So here, let me just give you an example here. If I have multiple subscriptions, I would be able to select the subscription I want to manage. In this case, with my email address, Gregory Sheppard at InCycle Software, I actually have 3 subscriptions. I have this MSDN subscription. I had a free Azure trial, which is now disabled because the time has run out. And I also have a subscription that is the InCycle subscription. So just as a word to the wise, one thing I might recommend that you do is, if you are a part of an enterprise subscription, you may very well choose to use your company email address as your primary login for your enterprise subscription. And I would suggest that you perhaps create an email address or a number of email addresses, say, for example, your name, MSDN at Gmail, specifically to manage, say, an MSDN account. And the reason is that you can associate this one email address with many subscriptions, but because of the integration across several different applications, the Azure Portal, Visual Studio Online, and then integration within Visual Studio itself, it's very difficult at times to kind of get that single sign-on to do exactly as you will. And so I believe that oftentimes it's easier to have an email that's going to be used as a user ID specifically for a subscription, and it takes a lot of the confusion away. So time is moving here a little bit quicker than I'd like, so I want to get into some of the features that we can manage here in the preview portal. So this authentication cycle shows up fairly often as you're switching portals, and sometimes also switching applications, say from the Azure Portal to Visual Studio Online. So I have a web application here. And here in the preview portal, you can see the view is a lot different. One, it tends to be a little bit more graphical, that we try to organize information in sort of sets or boxes. So here, as an example, we see a graphical representation of requests and errors in the same way we saw them in the management portal. We see file storage usage, quotas, scaling, so auto-scaling, the ability for the application to scale on its own, depending on some parameters. We see our pricing information, information about this particular web application in terms of its pricing tier, events, recent events in terms of things that have occurred with this web application, any alerts, for example, out-of-memory errors or some kind of alerts that I can configure, which show up here as well. I have streaming logs, and some of the, I guess what's more interesting is the idea of deployment slots. So we talked a little bit about deployment slots. When you set up a web application, by default, you'll have one slot, which is a production slot, and you can set up 4 additional slots. That's a total of 5. In this particular case, I've set up a development slot, a test slot, a QA slot, and a production B slot. So if I were going to do A/B testing, so as an example, if I made some particular changes or the marketing department felt that there were some approaches to improve user interaction, I might deploy those changes or that particular version of the application into production B slot and test to see which of the versions of the application was best received by users. Let's take a look at this development slot. Azure has a very good integration with Visual Studio Online, which you may be aware is a source control, project management, and build tool available and well integrated into the Azure framework and within Visual Studio. It allows me to, for example, set up a continuous deployment build with my application, and I've actually been able. I actually did that a little earlier, and here we can see, as an example, that this particular slot, so this is a development slot of this application, is linked to Visual Studio Online, and I have a number of builds that have occurred over the last couple of hours, and they've been triggered by check-ins from my source control from Visual Studio into Visual Studio Online. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio, and I hope you're familiar with this effective Visual Studio interface, but this is Visual Studio 2013. It's a fairly straightforward web application, and I'll show you what it does in a little bit. But this particular application is integrated into my Visual Studio Online account, and I've been able to create a continuous deployment from my this Visual Studio client into Visual Studio Online, and then the build server in Visual Studio Online actually deploys into Azure. And that's effectively triggered by a check-in in this particular case. And I'm going to see if I can make a relatively small change in some code here. I'm actually going to change, say, the version number to, I'm going to save it. I'm going to check this code in. Okay, so that particular change has actually been checked in. I actually have a continuous build set up, and you can see that over the last several hours I've checked in code, and the build server, Visual Studio Online and the build server have done their work, and they've completed new builds, and they've queued up a new build in this particular case that will ultimately be deployed to that development slot. So what I'm going to do, just to prove that it does work, is to go to a version of this application. Each of the deployment slots is going to get a unique URL. In this particular case, I've kept a pretty simple nomenclature. Effectively, it's just going to be a -dev to represent the dev deployment slot. So I'm actually going to deploy that code change here to this development slot. And so you can see the current version is 1.8.1. And so that's going to take a couple of minutes to do its work. And in the meantime, let's head back over to here to the preview portal to take a look at some additional features. So we chatted a little bit about deployment slots, and hopefully you understand. I think most of you, if you've built and deployed it all, understand that we have a place to deploy for development and for tests, that we can test our application, and then we tend to promote perhaps to a QA environment, and then ultimately, after everybody's happy with how the application is behaving, we from QA to our production. In this particular case, it's a little strange to some degree in the sense that in this interface, if you look up here, this is the actual production slot. So this represents one slot, and then this is slot number 2, slot number 3, slot number 4, and this is slot number 5. So there are 5 slots based upon how this interface works. The primary slot, production slot, shows up here. So one of the neat things that we can do is that we can effectively promote our deployments from one slot to the next. And let's think of how we can do that. So currently, let's see what we have in this test. I believe the test slot is actually empty right now, which means that there's no real, although there is a work or process running behind the scenes, there's really employed to that particular slot. So we can see there's 0 requests. No one's kind of been working here in this test environment. And what I'm searching for here is this URL, and I'm going to click that URL and see that there's nothing going on here in this test slot. So what I can do is show you this feature of being able to swap one deployment to another. So I have something running in prod B, and I'm going to move that into the test slot. And this ability to swap is relatively easy. So in this particular case, my source is going to be the application that's running in the prod B slot. My destination, I'm going to change here to test, and pretty much I just select it. want to point out here that the interface is a little bit different. So we see this expanding canvas concept that we start out with, you know, a fairly high level, and we begin to drill down as we move to the right. It tends to be a little less intuitive to some degree, and sometimes, you know, as you move across, you sort of can get a little lost. So I was working here in this area, although we can see there's content in 2 columns over to the right. That you know, may not be as intuitive as some of our older applications, but it is interesting, and you could argue it does work. So in this case, I'm going to swap from prod B to my destination of test. I'm going to click OK. We see a couple of things going on. One is we get this notification in this left-hand panel here, and this notification lets us know that there's something actually going on. In this particular case, it's swapping web app slots, and when it's done, it'll let us know that it was successful, or perhaps maybe not successful. So that's taken a little bit of while, and so while that's working, there we go. So we get some success here, and now let's go back and so here is our test slot, and we're going to refresh this, and voila, we get to see that we have some web content. So this was what's running in our slot called prod B, and just to demonstrate so now we swapped, right? So before we had nothing in our test slot, and now nothing's in our prod B slot. So swapping is good, but sometimes we think the idea of swapping is that I'm sort of going to copy into a slot, but actually it is a true swap. And the reason why it's a true swap is that if we find that we don't like the swap, we can unswap. So we can reverse the swap and put things right back the way they were. So this is effectively an undo, or you know, a revert. And I guess the great thing about demos is there's a lot to see. The bad news is that there's so much that we tend not to get it all in. So we've gone through, we talked about deployment slots. We talked about being able to swap between them. I'm going to just go through and show you another feature that's actually pretty nice, and that's the ability to do the A/B testing. So here again is our primary production application, and in this particular production application, so as we see this interface, so we actually have this block of content, or focus, if you will. So these settings here, or these commands, actually relate to this particular web application. So what I'm looking for is the settings for this particular production application. You can see to some degree that this approach is not as intuitive as the management portal, but it is interesting in its own right as an approach to manage. So the thing that I wanted to show you here, one, that we have a bunch of properties for this application. We saw some of these same things in the dashboard, in the management portal. Location, FTP, diagnostics, host name, etc. Application settings, if you remember, we can actually set application-specific settings. We can scale the application, which I've already done in this case. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you do a swap, some of the settings may need to be reset. In this particular case, this application would scale, and I tried to set it up so that at about a quarter of the hour, it would scale up to 3 instances. But what I wanted to show you here was the ability to route traffic and to perform this A/B testing. So I have the primary web application GS DevOps webinar, and you saw that I created a prod B. In this particular case, with static routing, I can perform my A/B testing by setting up traffic routing, and by changing the parameters and selecting a slot, I can move 50% of the traffic that would go to the primary production application, and I want to move 50% of that traffic to the prod B slot, and in this particular one slot, so 1% goes back, so it's effectively 51% to B and then 49% to prod. This would give me the opportunity to take a look at my analytics and find out, if one particular version of the application was more sticky than another. So I can perform this A/B testing or testing in production using the static routing or this traffic routing feature of Azure. And we're almost out of time, but I wanted to see if I could take another minute or two to take you through application insights, which I've set up for this particular application. And application insights, I think, is a very powerful tool, and it gives you a great degree of insight into your application, from application health, usage analytics, operations, so I may have a little configuration issue here, but you can see that I can look over a timeline and look at my application health in terms of server response time here, the amount of time it takes a browser page to load, the number of server requests, the number of failed requests. I can look at user analytics across users, across sessions, page views, custom events. So application analytics is a very great feature which you can effectively apply to a web application. I think we're really almost out of time here, so I'm going to try to wrap up. So we wanted to get through a couple of things in managing the portal. There's really a lot going on, and sometimes it doesn't go as fast as you'd like, but we talked a little bit about web apps, Visual Studio integration, from Visual Studio into Visual Studio Online directly into Azure, and the ability to push changes from code directly into a deployment slot. We talked about continuous deployment, again, Visual Studio and Azure integration, briefly showed you some of the things in the web diagnostics and the web A/B testing, and some of the features of application insights. And again, remember, that's the picture of the management portal, pretty straightforward. Here's our more modern look of the preview portal. and I guess some summary ideas. So the first is that DevOps plus Azure is an opportunity. I think if you just saw some of the things that I briefly went through with, relatively simple mouse clicks, and realizing that obviously I spent some time before to get some of those things set up, but it's relatively straightforward compared to most other or any other approach that you might use to manage and deploy applications. This has got to be as simple as it gets, while the simplicity still has a great deal of leverage and power and flexibility. Leverage Visual Studio. Visual Studio is well integrated with Visual Studio Online, which provides you with source control, management tools, and the ability to deploy continuously if that's something that you and your organization are ready for. The combination is just extremely powerful. Leverage source control, whether it's TFS or Git, you can deploy from a number of different source control tools directly into Azure. Master the portals, but again, the real big takeaway is that everything in Azure is automatable. So if you're going to repeat something, you need to think about automating it. So all repeatable actions and processes should be scripted using PowerShell or some of the other tools. And one of the other tools that is now available is a Logic app, and a Logic app effectively allows you to manage and orchestrate process and or automation. So if you had a SaaS application and you were, let's just say it was some kind of a CRM system, and every time you added a new contact into CRM, you needed to move that same contact into, say an Outlook contact management system. The Logic app will allow you actually to perform that orchestration. Or for another opportunity, you could every time you got a new business contact, you could send a text message to someone on your business development team. So Logic apps actually are a great tool for helping you manage and orchestrate and to bring some of that process and automation into your DevOps and to your application management portfolio. So bigger, faster, smarter, adopt continuous integration. We've talked a little bit about Visual Studio, Visual Studio Online, and Azure all working together. Automate as much as you can. If it's repeatable, it's probably worth automating. Use source control. It's obviously going to save you and provide you with the discipline and management control that you need to ensure that your process works and that you can continue to build upon success in your application development and deployment process. So I think we're just a couple of minutes over, but if we have some questions, I'm certainly available to take questions right now. And in the interim, I'm going to turn this back over to Stephanie. And Stephanie has some information about offers that are available.
Thank you, Gregory. That was great, and I really enjoyed your live demos. So the first offer I wanted to talk about while you're thinking about any questions you may have is the Assessment and Roadmap with AZDPS. This can assess your company's readiness to move to Azure, review context applications, network, and many more. It can perform a high-level financial analysis of the solution, including implementation costs, TCO, and ROI analysis. This can also build a roadmap on how to adopt Azure or move your company to Azure. Then the next offer I want to talk about is Dev and Test with Azure Jumpstart. The InCycle engagement model can quickly bring your organization to implementing Azure for your development and test environments. This includes setting up your Azure network. We can also provide a free presentation of this accelerator roadmap. It is a proven way based on successful past experience with our customer base. And depending on your dollars commitment with Azure, there may be a portion subsidized by Microsoft, but this is to be determined. And then the last offer I want to talk about is custom training or coaching. We have predefined training or coaching sessions available with different aspects of Azure architecting, networking, or other Azure workloads. So please contact us for more details. But again, some Microsoft dollars may be available depending on your commitment. So at this time, after talking about the offers, if you have any questions, I will go ahead and unmute the audience. I have unmuted, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Well, I think maybe we're good on questions for today, Stephanie. So if you do have any questions, feel free to contact us at info@InCycle Software and reference the getting started with the Azure portal so that we might be able to get some context to your question. But thanks for taking the time to spend some time with us and discussing this topic, and we look forward to engaging with you sometime soon.
Thank you again, Gregory.